After my father's funeral, the heavy silence in the Lakeside Manor library was shattered by a single, greedy voice. My brother-in-law, Timothy, stood up, smoothed his expensive suit, and boldly declared, "All the stocks and the $6 million inheritance go to my wife, Christina. She is the oldest daughter, and that is the law." He smirked at me, expecting me to crumble. He expected the grieving daughter. Instead, the lawyer and I exchanged a look of pure, icy amusement. We almost burst out laughing, because Timothy's wife wasn't what he thought she was. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. And since we have just stepped into a brand new year, I want to wish our entire community a massive Happy New Year 2026. I hope this year brings you peace, justice, and the strength to set the boundaries you deserve. If you are ready to support the channel and grow with us this year, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps us out. Now, let's see why Timothy's victory lap was about to hit a wall. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a vase. I didn't even stand up. In my line of work as a forensic accountant, you do not react to fraud with emotion. You react with evidence. And Timothy's little speech? It was just a bad audit waiting to happen. I looked at Mr. Vance, my father's attorney, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal to drop the hammer. Vance didn't even look up from his file. He just adjusted his glasses and slid a single thin document across the mahogany table. It wasn't a check. It was a birth certificate, attached to a sealed court order from 1989. He said, very quietly, that Timothy might want to check his sources because Christina was not the oldest daughter. In the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the eyes of this trust, Christina was not a daughter at all. The silence in the room shifted from heavy to suffocating. Timothy laughed, a nervous, barking sound, and asked what kind of sick joke this was. He said everyone knew Christina was adopted by my parents when she was 12. He said they had raised her. He said she had the family name. Vance corrected him with lethal precision. He said my parents had indeed taken Christina in as foster parents. They had raised her. They had fed her. But they had never legally adopted her. And the reason was sitting right there in the file Timothy was refusing to read. He explained that due to Christina's extensive juvenile record, the theft, the assault charges, the arson attempt, when she was 14 the state had blocked the adoption process. My father had fought for it initially, but after the third arrest, he had stopped filing the paperwork. Christina wasn't an heir. She was, legally speaking, a former ward of the state who had aged out of the system while living under my parents' roof. Christina's face went the color of old ash. She whispered that Dad had promised. She said she was the favorite. She looked at me, expecting me to back her up, to say it was just a paperwork error, but I just stared back at her, cold and unblinking. I knew the truth because for the last decade, I wasn't just the daughter. I was the financial guardian of this estate. While Christina was off playing socialite in the city, racking up credit card debt that my father quietly paid off to avoid scandal, I was the one sitting in this library, balancing the ledgers. I was the one who managed the medical bills when Dad had his first stroke. I was the one who hired the nurses for Mom when her dementia started to creep in. I saw every transaction. I saw the thousands of dollars siphoned away by Christina for emergencies that always turned out to be vacations or new cars. I had been the silent investor in this family's survival. I paid the property taxes when cash was tight. I managed the portfolio to ensure there would be an inheritance left to fight over. Christina wasn't a sibling to me. She was a liability. She was a recurring expense that offered zero return on investment. And now, seeing her stand there, realizing that her entitlement had no legal standing, I felt a distinct sense of professional satisfaction. The numbers finally balanced. Timothy slammed his hand on the table, rattling the antique lamp. He shouted that they weren't going anywhere. He said possession was 9/10 of the law and that they were moving in to care for my mother, Anna, whether I liked it or not. He said they had squatters' rights. I watched them, analyzing their desperation. They weren't grieving. They were panicking. And panic makes people dangerous. They didn't leave. That was my first miscalculation. I assumed shame would drive them out, but I forgot that parasites don't feel shame, they only feel hunger. Instead of packing their bags, Christina and Timothy dug in. They declared they were exercising caregiver priority, a legal gray area they had clearly Googled 5 minutes prior. They claimed that since my mother, Anna, was frail and grieving, they had a moral duty to stay in the lakeside manor to protect her. Within 24 hours, the estate transformed from a home into a fortress. When I drove up the winding driveway the next morning, the electronic gate was closed. The code had been changed. I called the house line, but it was dead. I called Mrs. Higgins, my mother's nurse of 6 years, only to find out she had been fired that morning. Timothy had met her at the door, handed her a check that I knew would bounce, and told her that family was handling things now. I stood outside the iron gates, watching the house. I could see Christina moving past the windows in the master suite, my parents' suite. She wasn't caring for my mother. She was trying on her life. She was wearing my mother's silk robe, holding a glass of wine at 10 in the morning, pacing back and forth with a manic energy that radiated even from a distance. I watched her, and I analyzed it. A lot of people would call this simple greed. But in my profession, you learn to look deeper. This wasn't just about the $6 million. This was a textbook narcissistic injury. When the lawyer exposed Christina as a ward of the state rather than the golden child, it didn't just hurt her feelings. It shattered the false reality she had built her entire identity around. She had spent 45 years believing she was the princess of this kingdom. When that mirror cracked, she didn't feel sadness. She felt a primal, existential threat. That kind of psychological break is dangerous. It triggers an extinction burst, a final, desperate explosion of behavior designed to force the world back into the shape they want. Christina wasn't staying in that house to help my mother. She was staying to prove she still owned it. She was trying to rewrite the will through sheer force of will. She needed to be the heir, so she would play the role of the heir, even if she had to hold my mother hostage to do it. Timothy walked down the driveway to meet me at the gate. He didn't open it. He just smiled through the bars, that same arrogant smirk he had worn at the funeral. He told me that Mom was resting and didn't want to be disturbed. He said she was confused and that my presence was upsetting her. He was gaslighting me in real time, using my mother's dementia as a weapon to lock me out. I told him that this was illegal. I told him eviction notices were being drafted. He just laughed and said possession was 9/10 of the law, and by the time the courts processed anything, they would have established residency. He turned his back on me and walked up the hill, twirling the gate remote on his finger like a toy. I realized then that a civil lawsuit wasn't going to work. Legal eviction would take months that my mother didn't have. They had cut the lines. They had fired the help. They were isolating the victim to bleed the accounts dry. If I wanted to save her, I couldn't just be a daughter or a plaintiff. I had to be a forensic accountant. I had to stop looking at the gate and start looking at the money. I drove back to the city, but I didn't go to a lawyer's office. I went to my own office, a quiet, sterile room with 3 monitors and a secure server. Timothy and Christina thought they were fighting a family feud. They thought this was about emotions, about who Mom loved more. They didn't realize they were fighting a forensic audit. And in my world, you don't win by shouting. You win by tracking the flow of funds. I sat down at my desk and opened the estate's financial dashboard. I still had full access. I could see everything: the main trust, the investment portfolio, the household operating account, and I saw the bleeding immediately. In the 48 hours since they had moved in, there were already pending charges on the household card grocery deliveries that included $500 in wine, new linens, a consultation fee for an interior decorator. They were redecorating a house they didn't own with money they hadn't inherited. I could have frozen the accounts right then. I could have cut off the credit cards and watched them scramble. But that would have been reactive. It would have just made them desperate. And desperate people are unpredictable. I needed them to be comfortable. I needed them to feel safe enough to make a mistake. I needed them to cross the line from family dispute to federal crime. So, I built a trap. It's a technique we use in fraud investigations called a honeypot or a Trojan horse. I created a new, segregated sub-account linked to the household expenses. I labeled it emergency medical and living expenses, Anna Trust. I transferred exactly $120,000 into it. It was a specific number large enough to be tempting, small enough to look like a plausible operating budget for Mom's care. Then, I did the forensic work. I digitally tagged every single dollar in that account. I set up real-time alerts that would ping my phone the second a transfer over $500 was initiated. I linked the account to a specialized ledger that tracked IP addresses and device IDs for every login. I wasn't just giving them money. I was handing them a GPS-tracked bag of cash. I sent Timothy an email. I kept it professional, almost submissive. I told him that while the lawyers sorted out the custody issues, I wanted to ensure Mom's care wasn't interrupted. I told him I had set up a specific account for her medical bills, food, and staff salaries. I gave him the login credentials. I told him the balance was $120,000 and that it was strictly for Anna's direct care. It was the perfect bait. To a narcissist like Christina, it looked like capitulation. It looked like I was admitting defeat and handing over the keys. To a greedy man like Timothy, it looked like a slush fund. They wouldn't be able to resist. They would justify it to themselves, borrowing against their future inheritance, paying themselves a management fee, reimbursing themselves for their time. I sat back and watched the screen. The login alert came 17 minutes later. Device ID, iPhone 15 Pro, registered to Timothy. He was in. He was looking at the balance. I could practically see him smiling. He thought he had won. He didn't realize that by logging into that account, he had just walked into a federal evidence locker. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for them to steal from a dying woman. The waiting game was shorter than I expected. 3 days later, I decided to drive up to the manor one last time. Not to confront them, but to check on my mother. The alerts on the Trojan Horse account had been too quiet. It made me nervous. I needed to see her. I needed to know she was still there. The drive up the cliffside road was treacherous. The estate sat on a promontory overlooking the lake, accessible only by a narrow, winding asphalt ribbon with a steep drop into deep water on one side and a sheer rock face on the other. It was beautiful, but dangerous. As I rounded the final blind curve before the gate, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A black truck. Timothy's truck. He wasn't passing me. He was accelerating. I saw the grill of his truck fill my mirror, massive and aggressive. I tapped my brakes, signaling him to back off. He didn't. He slammed into my rear bumper. The impact jolted my spine, snapping my head back against the headrest. My car skidded toward the edge, gravel spraying into the void below. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder. I fought the steering wheel, correcting the skid, pulling back toward the rock face. He hit me again, harder this time, a metal-on-metal scream that echoed off the cliffs. I saw his face in the mirror, red, contorted, screaming something I couldn't hear. He was trying to push me off the road. He wanted me gone. He wanted the only obstacle to the inheritance at the bottom of the lake. I slammed on the accelerator, putting distance between us, my tires screeching as I fishtailed around the final bend. I made it to the gate, punched in the override code I had programmed years ago, and drove through. Timothy stopped at the gate. He didn't follow me onto the property. He just sat there in his idling truck, watching me. It was a warning. A violent, physical line in the sand. Come back, and you die. I parked the car, shaking so hard I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I ran to the front door, pounding on the wood. No answer. I used my key, the one key they hadn't managed to change yet. I burst into the foyer. "Mom?" I screamed. "Mom!" Silence. The house smelled stale, like dust and old flowers. I ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw open the door to the master suite. The bed was unmade. Christina's wine glasses were on the nightstand, but Mom wasn't there. I found her in the guest room down the hall, the small, cramped room they had moved her into so Christina could take the master. She was in bed, looking so small, so frail. Her breathing was shallow, a terrible, rattling sound. Her skin was gray. She looked at me, her eyes unfocused, and whispered a single word, water. I scrambled to get her a glass, lifting her head, helping her drink. She was dehydrated. She was starving. They had locked her away in this room like a forgotten piece of furniture. I called 911, screaming at the operator to hurry. I held her hand, telling her I was there, telling her it was going to be okay. But I knew it wasn't. I could feel the life slipping out of her, the final reserves of strength exhausted by fear and neglect. She squeezed my hand once, weak and trembling. "Take care of the house," she whispered. And then the squeeze loosened. The rattling breath stopped. The silence returned, heavy and final. My mother was gone. She hadn't died from old age. She had died from heartbreak. She had died because her own family viewed her as an inconvenience. I sat there for a long time, holding her cold hand. I didn't cry. The grief was too big for tears. It was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, crushing the air out of my lungs. I walked out of the room and closed the door softly. I walked down the hall to the master suite. Christina's clothes were everywhere. Timothy's watch was on the dresser. They were living their best life while my mother died down the hall. That was the moment the sadness turned into something else. It hardened. It crystallized into a diamond-sharp resolve. I wasn't a forensic accountant anymore. I was an executioner, and I had the weapon I needed. My phone pinged in my pocket. A single, distinct chime. I pulled it out, an alert from the bank. Transfer initiated, $120,000. Recipient, T&C Consulting LLC. Status, pending. They had done it. They hadn't even waited for the body to cool. Timothy had logged in, seen the balance, and drained the entire account. He thought he was being clever, wiring it to a shell company. He didn't know I owned the servers. He didn't know I had the tracking logs. He didn't know he had just committed wire fraud, elder abuse, and theft across state lines. I looked at the notification, then back at the door where my mother lay. "Rest now, Mom," I whispered. "I'll take care of the house. And I'll take care of them." The funeral was less a memorial and more a victory lap for the parasites. Christina stood at the front of the church, weeping into a lace handkerchief that I knew cost $300 because I had seen the charge on the household card 2 days ago. She was wearing a brand new black designer dress, tailored to perfection. Timothy stood beside her, checking his phone, looking bored. He was wearing a new watch, not a Patek Philippe, but a flashy, gold-plated monstrosity that screamed new money. They looked like they had won the lottery. In their minds, they had. With Mom gone, they believed the squatter phase was over and the owner phase had begun. They accepted condolences with the gracious nods of manor lords, completely oblivious to the fact that the forensic noose was already tightening around their necks. I didn't stand with them. I stood in the back, watching. I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had dried up in that guest room, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Every time Timothy checked his watch, I mentally added another year to his sentence. Every time Christina sobbed for the mother she adored, I added another count of fraud to the file. After the service, we returned to Lakeside Manor for the wake. The house was filled with strangers, distant relatives, and friends of my parents who whispered about how tragic it was. They ate the catered food, they drank the wine, and then, one by one, they left. When the last car pulled away, the silence descended. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with dust. I walked into the living room. Christina and Timothy had retreated to the master suite to count their imaginary blessings, leaving me alone with the ghosts. I walked over to the bay window overlooking the lake. There, facing the glass, was Mom's favorite armchair. It was a worn, velvet thing, the fabric crushed permanently into the shape of her body. For the last 10 years, this was her world. She would sit here for hours, watching the water, drinking her tea, feeling the sun on her face. I sat on the floor beside the empty chair and rested my head against the armrest. It still smelled like her lavender and old paper. The emptiness of that chair hit me harder than the funeral had. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a void. It was a physical testament to the space she used to occupy, a space that was now violently empty. This is what people don't understand about greed. It doesn't just take money. It takes up space. It pushes out love, it pushes out care, and eventually it pushes out life. Christina and Timothy hadn't just stolen $120,000. They had stolen the last months of peace my mother deserved. They had turned her home into a prison, and her final days into a negotiation. That empty chair wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime scene. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my server. The final trace on the wire transfer was complete. The money hadn't just gone to a shell company. It had moved across state lines to an offshore account Timothy had set up years ago in a clumsy attempt at tax evasion, federal wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse. I looked at the screen, the blue light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty air. I looked back at the empty chair. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you, Mom," I whispered into the velvet, "but I promise you, I'm going to bury them." I stood up and smoothed my dress. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but I wrapped it in layers of cold, professional detachment. I wasn't a grieving daughter anymore. I was the auditor. And the audit was about to begin. I sent a text to Mr. Vance. "Meeting is confirmed for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Bring the file. I have the rest." Upstairs, I heard Christina laugh, a shrill, victorious sound that echoed down the staircase. Let them laugh for one more night. Let them sleep in the master suite and dream of millions, because when they woke up, they wouldn't be heirs. They would be defendants. The meeting at Mr. Vance's office was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Christina and Timothy arrived at 8:50, striding into the conference room with the air of people who had already won the lottery. Christina was wearing a black dress that I recognized from a Vogue spread, and Timothy had polished his gold watch until it caught every light in the room. They didn't look like mourners. They looked like investors arriving for a payout. They sat on one side of the table. I sat on the other. Mr. Vance sat at the head, a thick file folder in front of him. Christina didn't even wait for him to open it. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, and said, "We know this is hard for you, Taylor, but we really need to settle the estate. Mom would have wanted us to move on. We'll need the keys to the city apartment, too." I didn't respond. I just looked at her. I looked at the woman who had spent 40 years believing the world owed her a living. I looked at the man who had tried to run me off a cliff. And I felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone. The grief was boxed away. Mr. Vance cleared his throat. He opened the file. But he didn't pull out a check. He pulled out a single sheet of paper with a highlighted paragraph. "Before we discuss the distribution of assets," Vance said, his voice dry as dust, "we need to address the goodwill clause your father inserted into the trust 5 years ago." Timothy frowned. "What clause?" "Just give us the money." "The clause," I interrupted, my voice calm and level, "was a test. Dad knew you were greedy, Christina. He knew you felt entitled, but he also hoped, deep down, that you might have a shred of humanity left. So, he built a contingency." I pointed to the paper. "The trust states that if the primary beneficiary mom became incapacitated, and if any family member moved in to provide adequate, humane care for a period of 30 days, the trust would automatically release a stipend of $500,000 to that caregiver. No questions asked. All you had to do was be kind. All you had to do was treat her like a human being for 1 single month." The color drained from Christina's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was doing the math. She was realizing the magnitude of her error. This is the counterfactual world, the agonizing realization of what could have been. If she had just fed my mother, if she had just kept the nurse, if she had just sat in that chair and held her hand, She would be $500,000 richer right now. Legally. Cleanly. You traded a legitimate $500,000, I said, leaning forward, for a stolen $120,000. Timothy slammed his fist on the table. What stolen money? That was an operating budget. You gave us access. I gave you access to a forensic trap, I corrected. I signaled Vance, and he pulled out the second document. It was a flowchart. It showed the transfer of the $120,000 from the Anna Trust account to T&C Consulting, and then, immediately, to an offshore account in the Caymans. Every step was time-stamped. Every IP address was logged. This is a federal wire fraud report, I said. And since you moved the money across international lines, it's also money laundering. But that's just the financial side. We also have the physical evidence. I placed a USB drive on the table. It made a small, plastic click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. You thought the gate cameras were just for show, Timothy, I said. They aren't. They record in 4K with high-fidelity audio. I have the footage of your truck ramming my car. I have the audio of you screaming that you were going to put me in the lake. That's attempted vehicular manslaughter. Timothy stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You set us up. This is entrapment. It's not entrapment, I said, standing up to meet him. It's an audit. You failed the character test. You failed the legal test. And you failed the intelligence test. You thought you were fighting a grieving daughter. You were fighting a forensic accountant. And the audit is closed. Christina let out a low, keen sound, like a wounded animal. She wasn't crying for Mom. She wasn't crying for me. She was crying because the false reality she lived in had finally, violently collapsed. The narcissistic injury was complete. She wasn't the heir. She wasn't the victim. She was just a criminal. The door to the conference room opened. 2 officers in uniform stepped in, followed by a detective in a suit. They didn't need to ask who was who. The guilt was written in the sweat on Timothy's forehead and the terror in Christina's eyes. Timothy Vance. Christina Vance, the detective said. You are under arrest. As they were handcuffed, Timothy looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The greed was gone. There was only fear. Taylor, he pleaded. We're family. No, I said, turning away to look out the window. You were a liability, and I just wrote you off. The handcuffs clicked, and just like that, the noise stopped. I didn't stand at the window to watch them get shoved into the back of the squad car. I didn't need to see the perp walk. In my line of work, the satisfaction doesn't come from the drama. It comes from the documentation. The evidence was locked, the case was airtight, and the liability had been removed from the books. I drove back to Lakeside Manor alone. The gate was open, the electronic lock disabled. I parked my car and walked to the front door. The house was quiet. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of neglect that had filled these halls a week ago. It was a clean silence. The kind you find in an empty church or a fresh spreadsheet. It was the silence of a problem solved. I walked through the foyer, past the spot where Timothy had smirked at me, past the guest room where my mother had taken her last breath. I didn't stop. I went straight to the library, my father's office, now mine. I sat down at the heavy oak desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim light. I pulled up the master file. Estate of Anna Vance versus T&C Consulting. The status bar blinked green next to the word active. I clicked the drop-down menu. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a second, savoring the moment. Then, I selected closed. I hit save. The file vanished into the archives. Just another completed audit in a long career of catching thieves. The money, the $6 million, the stocks, the diversified portfolio, it didn't go into my personal account. I didn't need it. I had my career. I had my own home. I had my integrity. Keeping it would have felt like keeping a stain. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I established the Anna Vance Foundation for Elder Care. Every single dime would go toward providing legal and financial protection for vulnerable seniors. It would fund nurses who couldn't be fired by greedy relatives and lawyers who specialized in stopping people like Christina. It was the only way to truly balance the moral books. I walked out the back doors and down to the dock. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of violet and gold. The air smelled like pine needles and deep water, not dust and greed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they burned. I had lost my mother, and no amount of forensic accounting could bring her back. But I had protected her dignity. I had evicted the parasites, and for the first time in months, the ledger was perfectly, beautifully balanced. If you've ever had to cut off toxic family to save your own peace, type case closed in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice.